Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. All right, Mr. Dominic Frisby, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be here.
We were just talking about Aristotle, I think.
We were talking, I was about to sing the praises of walking. We were talking about writing techniques, and Aristotle his school was called the Peripatetic School, and he used to hold his lessons while walking. So the students didn't sit down in class and listen to him holding court at the front. They would all go on a walk, and he would teach them while he was walking. And a lot of the time, the ancient Greeks did stuff and they couldn't necessarily explain it. And we're only just starting to explain it scientifically now. But you look a lot of great writers, P.G. Wodehouse, great comic writer, Nassim Taleb, great philosophical writer. They're big advocates of walking. And apparently what happens is it's something like when you're walking, the part of the brain that inhibits creativity is focused on the automated function of walking. And as a result, you're more likely to have good ideas. And I think if you think a lot of people have good ideas when they're doing something automated, in the baths, another one in the shower, recycling and walking. So I think, and I actually, when I go and walk the dog, I often listen to podcasts and I find I'm way more responsive to them, listening to them while I walk.
Right.
And so, on the benefits of walking is the first theme of today's show.
I find maybe it's exercise in general, because when I go to the gym actually, and I'll listen to podcasts, and I find myself as I get more warmed up, my heart rate's going, I'm sweating, the ideas start to flow too. So I start taking notes pretty feverishly in my phone. Just usually in like a notes app categorized by different topics I'm thinking about or writing on. And then I'll grab those ideas later and incorporate those into my writing. But I found it to just be a time of day when, I'm probably having ideas 10 to 1 when I'm exercising versus just sitting around.
There's a comic writer in England called Dominic English. He's not very famous. He keeps a low profile, but he writes for some of the most famous comedians in the UK, Jimmy Carr and various others. And he's been in the business 30 or 40 years, and it's a difficult business to stay in and earn a living at for that long. And Dominic's writing method, he makes me laugh, is he'll get the brief, whatever the writing brief for the morning is. We want jokes about Bitcoin, or we want jokes about Joe Biden, or whatever the brief is. And he'll do a bit of, he'll watch a couple of Bitcoin videos or a couple of Joe Biden videos or read some articles or whatever it is. And then he literally he takes his iPad and he goes to the gym and he goes on the cross trainer, the one where you do that.
Yeah.
He writes all his material while he's doing the cross trainer.
Interesting.
And he'll be doing it and he'll keep stopping and writing jokes down and does that. And then by the time he's got off his 1 hour session or whatever it is, he's got his jokes for the day written. And then he goes home to his computer and just tidies them all up and neatens them all up and sends them off.
Yeah, it's a great strategy. the creative juices that people always talk about, I think it's real. It seems to be real, at least. Once you get the blood flowing, the sweat moving, the creativity ramps up too. Um, so shifting tact a little bit, I know we're going to talk about price action. We're recording right now. This is May 22nd, 2021. Bitcoin just incurred I guess almost a 50% drawdown at one point. I think it peaked at around 64,000 perhaps. And I think it drew down to the low 30,000s. Some say even below 30,000 on some exchanges. So yeah, how are you thinking about that? How are you handling it? Any words of wisdom for people that may have been shaken up by the volatility?
I'm handling it with a certain amount of sorrow, because obviously you want it to go up. And I'm pretty good at reading markets, I think, and looking at price levels. I'm not so good at trading them. That's much harder. But I tend not to trade crypto that much. Probably I should trade it. I used to trade it more, but it's a technical reason why I don't do it now. It's just to do with the software I've got. But I think according to my apps, it was 64 was the high, or 63.90 or something, and it went to 30. So that's a 50% correction, and then it rallied to maybe 42. And there's a massive line of resistance at 42. It's one of those pivot points. It was support for a long time, and I think it's going to be resistance for a while. And as when I last looked this morning, it was at 35.
Yeah.
So that's where we are now. I'm well aware of the sort of, in each bull run, it has 40% or 35, 40% corrections on its way of doing 10 or multiples. However many, let's say the 2016-17 bull market went from $200 or $300 to eventually 20,000.
Yeah.
And in that journey, it had 40% correction, something like that.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is over 50 already. Yeah. So I'm inclined to think that we might be going into a little bit of a crypto winter.
Interesting.
I don't think it's going to be as extreme as some of the other crypto winters, because I don't think the bull market that preceded it is extreme. But I think a lot more people own Bitcoin than we're led to believe. And, it always looks obvious in the rearview mirror. It always does.
Yeah.
But, we had an altcoin season. Altcoin season normally marks the end. It wasn't the craziest altcoin season I've ever known, but it was an altcoin season. And, the Coinbase IPO, those big IPOs, they always mark something. Well, not always, but they often mark something.
Yeah.
And then, Elon Musk, and there was, so there, I just think it maybe gone a little bit too far.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of not that worried about it really, because, Bitcoin's it is like I often say, if you were a Marvel comic and you were designing the ultimate bubble asset, you would design it. It would be a new technology that is money. And that is Bitcoin basically. Yeah. So I'm afraid speculative manias accompany it on the upside, and then the corresponding bear markets are equally emotional.
Yeah.
And I think it would be typical of Bitcoin to go back to 20,000. Yeah. The old high, and kiss it goodbye.
Yeah.
So that's my theories. I think we go.
Do you have you mentioned a brief crypto winter. Do you have timelines in mind? Like when do you think it would? When do you think it would break its 64,000?
How long do crypto winters typically last? A year?
What's that?
How long do crypto winters typically last? A year? Would you say?
So we had a blow off top in December 17. It drew down over 12 months to a low of that was 20,000. It drew down to 3,500. It then had a run up again to 14,000 in mid 19. So that was 18 months, but then it drew down again to COVID of like 3,400 or 3,800 maybe. Typically, I think it's 18 to 24 months before it breaks the prior all-time high again. it's about a 4-year cycle. So it's, 2 years is roughly prior all-time high to breaking it again.
I don't think it'll be that long. But I think we could go, and you just don't know. But
yeah,
a realistic prognosis is that we go to 20,000 and then we range trade for a bit, and, within that range trade, there'll be a bull market that goes on for 3 or 4 months, and then there'll be a bear market. And, as well as extreme emotional euphoria and extreme emotional pessimism, there are times when Bitcoin experiences extreme emotional boredom.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so maybe we need another one of those periods as well. It's still the go-to asset. The other reason I'm a little bit less positive than some about Bitcoin's chances are that I'm not selling any of my Bitcoin, by the way. In fact, I'm hoping to be able to save up more money and that it goes down to 20,000 or even 12,000. There's a big obvious technical line at 12 or 14,000, so that I can buy more. But if you look at Bitcoin's over the last year or so, it's traded very much like a tech stock. And it's sort of almost tracked the NASDAQ. If you put the Bitcoin chart over the NASDAQ, the patterns are very similar. And if you go back to, say, the late 1980s, from the late 1980s to about 2000, tech, digital, dramatically outperformed real stuff, commodities, mining, farming, this kind of thing. And then from about 2000, top of the dot-com bull market through to maybe 2003, real stuff dramatically outperformed. And then from maybe, I'm going to say 2004 to about 2009, the two they were both going up, but they both, if you compared the two, they were kind of flat with each other. They were in a range. And then from 2009 through till now, digital tech has just killed real stuff. The outperformance has been huge.
Yeah.
And, there's very good reason for that. We've talked about it already. Digital is just so much more scalable than real stuff. There's just vastly more growth potential. But you do still need real stuff. And I think we've been seeing over the last 2 or 3 months a rotation into real stuff. And if you look at the copper price, things like tin, aluminium, zinc, oil, they're all in massive bull markets, farming stocks, grain, lumber. Yeah. And so, I think there's a real rotation going on into real stuff. And we might be in a relative bull market for real stuff for maybe a couple of years. That doesn't mean Bitcoin and tech don't go up. But it's sort of commodities turn to shine for a couple of years.
Right. Well,
just a theory,
of course. That what is the old saying that all models are wrong, some are useful, most are dangerous. So take everything we're saying here with a grain of salt. But I'd like to
go on, you go.
Just to add a little counterbalance to, I guess you would say maybe your neutral to bearish outlook on crypto short term, at least. I actually think this correction is a normal part of the bull market. I think Bitcoin's price action is still driven predominantly by its supply and demand fundamentals. So the halving is driving these cycles still. I expect to see a new all-time high price in mid-Q4, and I think we're going above $300,000. That's also, and the reason I did this model years ago, which again, all models are wrong. Some are useful, most are dangerous. And it had Bitcoin at 20,000 by December 2020, which we hit. We hit about 24,000, I think, by the end of the month. And it had Bitcoin at 244,000 by the end of this year. Now, that was before COVID. So when I reran the model, just basically putting some inflation in there, because all the printing that occurred in Q1 and Q2 of 20, typically the inflationary pressures of that activity hit about 18 months later, which just happened to line up with Bitcoin's peak price window. So I think US dollar inflation pressures, which we're already seeing today, but I think they're going to become especially evident in the next 6 months. And that's going to line up really well with Bitcoin's typical peak, which comes in about 510 days after the halving. So I'm still extremely bullish. Well, I think this correction that was a little more than 50%, I would attribute to a couple of things. One, Bitcoin's been really aggressive to the upside the past 5 or 6 months. It was outperforming my model 100%. So I expected a pretty strong correction. And two, I would say there's a mature options market built up around it. So if we get a little too levered long, when this thing does start to unwind, it's more volatile to the downside. So after being in Bitcoin this many years and I'm purely just treating it as a game of accumulation, the price doesn't faze me at all. Like, I don't know how to describe it. You get Bitcoin Zen, I guess, where you're just trying to increase your stack of sats and you're not so much worried about the price. But yeah, I guess I'm just much more in the bullish camp.
I'll be more worried about the price when I'm ready to sell. And it's not.
See, I don't ever want to sell. So
well, at some point, you've got to buy yourself a new fridge freezer, Robert.
Yeah. I mean, if there's some passionate item that I really want, then maybe I would trade Bitcoin for it at some point, ideally directly. But on principle, I really don't want to sell Bitcoin into fiat. Like, ideally, I'm just trying to take territory on this network. And we talked about this a little bit before, but that's why I just focus on generating income so I can live. And then taking excess and sweeping it into treasury for me, which is Bitcoin.
Yeah. And a more efficient way is to borrow against it rather than sell.
More efficient and more dangerous, but yes.
Yeah, absolutely more dangerous. I wish I was one of those guys that could be like state projections about what the market's going to do with total absolutism, as though he's stating fact. You get some of those newsletter writers.
Yeah.
They state with total certainty in order to sell more and more newsletters. And it's very charismatic and inspiring to watch. And I'm always a bit more, but, and I think actually you get more followers if you state stuff with absolute fact, because people like to know what's going to happen. It makes them feel more secure.
100%.
But anyway, I'm not worried about Bitcoin in the long term. And I suppose we can segue into one of the first things we wanted to talk about today, which was scalability, which is a subject we've talked about before. And we've talked about the scalability of digital tech versus the scalability of physical stuff. So, if you invent a brilliant app, you only need to upload it to the App Store once and it can be downloaded 1 million or 1 billion times. Whereas if you invent a brilliant widget, you've still got to manufacture 1 million or 1 billion of them and distribute them. And it's just makes the physical economy much harder to be scalable in. And that's why we've had this extraordinary growth in digital stuff. Yeah. But with this idea of scalability in mind, I want to talk about Bitcoin versus national currencies. Because a national currency, by the way, okay, we'll just focus on this. A national currency is limited by its borders. So there's just a limit to how big that currency can be, how big the market cap of that currency can be. And that even applies to something like the US dollar, which is limited by even though it's the sort of the global reserve currency, there are still the limitations of the US national borders. And then if China starts and Russia start using alternate currencies, there are just all sorts of limitations on a national currency. Those limitations don't exist on cryptocurrencies, which are inherently international. Yeah. So that gives something like Bitcoin the potential to be the international reserve currency of the internet. Let's call it that.
Yeah.
And the vastness of that role, the international reserve currency of the internet, you know, you're talking about then, that doesn't mean that the dollar disappears, but it means that the if you just think how big the internet economy is,
Right.
and Bitcoin becomes its international reserve currency, then you're talking about extraordinary potential long-term valuations.
It's a great analogy, and it's a good way to think about it, perhaps, that if the internet were a country, how would you value its currency? You know, you're betting on this country. Like, how effective is this country going to be in the digital age, I guess you would say. And, you know, the more commercial activity that takes place there, the more transactions are facilitated there, the more really value is created there, right? How much of our attention is being allocated into the internet or through the digital economy? That's a good proxy. Whatever you expect that growth pattern to be, that's a good proxy for the value of the money, because this is a money, again, with perfect supply and elasticity. So Bitcoin supply, unlike all these other national currencies, as purchasing power increases, the supply does not change at all. So Bitcoin's purely expressing this economic growth on the internet through its price. Whereas historically, like say in the US dollar, we've had all this economic growth in the country, but the central bank will actually harvest that economic surplus by violating the supply of money, by printing. So I think it's a wonderful analogy to look at it that way. And that, you know, all the things we've talked about, digital, how much it contributes to productivity and scaling and human cooperation, like how would you value the money that serves all of that? Because that is Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, although we talked about, you know, this rotation into real stuff, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't rise within that environment. You know, Bitcoin could quite easily detach itself from other tech stocks. I just noticed that they've been traveling in a similar direction. And, you know, if real stuff starts going up dramatically in price, and, you know, for example, I've got a mining background, and so I look at things like tin, and I'm massively long tin. There's a huge structural supply shortage in tin. Mm-hmm. And if that feeds into the real market, then that becomes inflation very quickly. You know, raw materials prices go up. And then that puts pressure on governments. Now, either they debase currency more or they tighten rates. But even now, even if they just tighten rates, you know, 0.5% or something, there's going to be so much deflationary pressure, margin call and everything. So that could hold Bitcoin back for a bit. Yeah. But, you know, the longer time goes on, the closer the inflationary cat is to getting out of the bag. Yeah. And that ultimately is good for Bitcoin.
I think this tipping point is the distribution of the latest rounds of QE that we're actually engaging in helicopter money. You know, in the US, we have all these forgivable loans being given out, these PPP loans. It's rife with fraud, by the way. I mean, people just go online, punch in a few numbers, and you get a big wire transfer that's a forgivable loan, or maybe it's a 30-year fixed loan. So I think this is the tipping point with this QE, because once you start, there's no politician that will ever go into office on the platform that he's going to remove the helicopter money that has been provided historically. So it only goes one direction, right? Just like government revenue, just like government bureaucracies and whatnot. They only tend to go one direction. So I think we're going to see some really, I guess you could say, semi-cataclysmic things happening in these national currencies over the next 10 to 15 years. I think we're going to have a wave of smaller currencies collapsing. And you'll see the relative purchasing power of stronger currencies grow, like the euro, like the dollar, like Chinese yuan. In that time, you'll see these currencies collapsing, and smaller currencies collapsing into larger currencies. But I also would expect Bitcoin to just radically outperform throughout that time period as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think the time frame is less than 10 to 15 years, Robert. I'd say 5. But my girlfriend is Irish, and she was in Ireland last week, and she said they've got a massive problem in Ireland, which everyone's getting their furlough money, which is the money they were paid while they're not working. Yeah. And so suddenly there's a shortage of workers. Nobody wants to be a shop assistant. They're
Yeah.
getting their €350 a week for not working.
Yeah.
Why would they go and work in a shop for €400
Yeah.
a week? They can
Government
do the 300.
intervention. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one problem. We have had these things called furlough money and also bounce back loans we had, which is for companies, where you could get a loan of up to $50,000 to help your company through the crisis.
Yeah.
Loads of people have set up companies in order to get a 50
Yeah.
grand
Yeah.
bounce.
Yeah.
It's just rife with fraud. And they just, the fraudsters always outwit the regulators and the government. And so, and it's all inflationary, and it will, it does not end well.
That's what, agreed completely. And that's why this particular round is so fundamentally different than, say, 2008, 2009, where the banks were actually decapitalized. So a lot of that QE went into recapitalizing the banks in those markets. We still had asset inflation as a result, but we didn't see it at the consumer level. This time, it's way different. It's an order of magnitude larger, and the distribution is direct to consumers. So I think inflation, I put out this prediction recently. I think the US dollar is gone in 15 years. I think it's hyperinflated.
Well, we have to, a lot of that depends on China.
Yeah.
When China's ready to pull the plug, it's got the gold, it might have the Bitcoin as well.
Right.
And, when it's ready, it depends. Apparently, the current leader, there's the whole thing of we must not shine too brightly until the time is right.
Right.
Current leader is quite a big egotist. Apparently, he might want he might want it on his watch.
Really?
Great unraveling. So,
how long is his watch? Do you know?
Well, as long as he lives.
So it's like that.
I don't think he's re-elected. I'm not that sure about Chinese politics, but I think he's got the gig, and for as long as he wants it.
Yeah. I'm not too educated on Chinese politics either, but I figured as much. Well, time will tell, I guess, but we do know that it ends badly, right? As we've seen through all the histories we've been looking at, these currency experiments end badly. Mm-hmm. So maybe if we could pivot back to the book, Daylight Robbery, and how we're walking through some of that. I mentioned to you before the show that I thought the Glorious Revolution, I'd never even heard of this, actually, that with the execution of Charles I sort of came the triumph of Parliament over monarchy, I suppose, where there were the God-given rights and sovereignty typically associated with the king was now decentralizing in a way. It was moving to a parliament, and the parliaments, they created these declarations for free speech, free elections, regularly convening parliaments, and they were also creating greater protections for individual life, liberty, and property. They were sowing the seeds for what would later become, the U.S. Constitution, effectively, right? The U.S. Constitution was premised on all these ideas.
Well, it was. And we're talking about a fairly long period in English history, from about probably the beginning of the 17th century or just after. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, basically the whole of the 17th century. And it started with James I and then Charles I, who were kings by divine right. Mm-hmm. And in those days, the king was God. He was seen as God. And it started with a war over taxes. Parliament, for some reason, had control of taxes, and Parliament wasn't crazy. Parliament was mostly Protestant, and Charles I was a Catholic. They weren't crazy, and Charles I had ambitions to fight wars in France, and Parliament wouldn't give him the money. And then he raised these ship taxes. Mm-hmm. The tax on shipping was one of the few taxes he could actually raise. And then this guy, John Hampden, refused to pay the shipping money. And he was a great parliamentarian, one of the people and it ended with the English Civil War. And in fact, John Hampden's statue is still in the House of Commons today. And the English Civil War was really a series of wars that went on for many decades, fought between Crown and Parliament eventually won. And then we had Oliver Cromwell, who was a great great military strategist. But at one point we had got the Scots had taken Charles I, and we paid £100,000 of silver to get him back off off the Scots. So £100,000 of silver was a king's ransom. Okay. And then Oliver Cromwell, when he became, I think it was Prince Regent or something was his title, or Regent, started paying himself £100,000 of silver annually. So he was paying himself literally a king's ransom. And then he died, and then his son wasn't as competent, and then they didn't really know what to do. And so we had this thing called the Restoration, where we actually got Charles II back from France and got him to be king. And actually, he was a really good king, and that was actually quite a happy time. And he was famous because when the Fire of London happened, he went out and, his advisors were all trying to get him away from it, and he went out and fought the fire. And he was known as the Merry King. And he despite fathering, I think, 13 children, he left no heirs because none of them were legitimate.
Wow! So
it was a pretty merry time he had of it. And then I think he died. His final words were, "I'm sorry it's taken me so long a dying." So by all accounts, he was known as the Merry King, and he was quite popular. And then his son James II came along, and he was less popular, much sterner, again Catholic. And Parliament decided they wanted to get rid of him. And so his daughter had married William, King of Holland, William of Orange, and they got William over, and William defeated James. And then this was known as the Glorious Revolution, the bloodless revolution, because he won without barely any loss of life. As it turned out, all the loss of life was in Ireland. There was the thing called many people were murdered in Ireland, but in England, it was known as the bloodless revolution. And then we got this thing, the English Bill of Rights, which was sort of the successor to Magna Carta, which had come about 300 or 400 years earlier. And again, Magna Carta was probably, its reputation is greater than its actual content, but they were great declarations of freedom. They got rid of the hearth tax. They recognized the individual rights and so on. And the Parliament was sovereign now, and the king wasn't sovereign anymore. And Parliament, if the king wanted to spend money, he had to go to Parliament and get their approval. And it made the monarch accountable to Parliament. So it was a decentralization of power. The whole process took decades, almost a whole century. But so finally we had this glorious revolution, 1687. Now, it wasn't all that glorious because about 10 years later, in order to fund his spending, the king founded the Bank of England, and we got the beginning of central banking. Right. So it wasn't, replacing one evil with another. But the point was, all those messages at the time about the freedom of the individual and the citizens' rights were very much embedded in the English mentality. And so when the American Civil War came, less than 100 years later, but all the English settlers or the British settlers who'd gone out and settled America, when they rose up against their English overlords, they didn't think they were fighting for new rights. They thought they were fighting for rights that were already enshrined in Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. So they had this mentality: no, we're not fighting for something new. We're fighting for what is ours. Yeah, And the great sort of successor to the English Bill of Rights was the American Constitution, which is a wonderful constitutional document if you're the sort of person that favors individual liberty and freedom and so on. And in fact, the American states model, where all the states are next to each other and competing with each other, is a wonderful force, that competition, to keep, if somehow people could put a rein on federal spending, but the rivalry between states. For example, now everyone leaving New York to go to Florida and Texas, that's a wonderful force of competition to keep government small. But unfortunately, it seems to have lost accountability at the federal level, even though it's remained at the local level.
Yeah, it seems to me that these transformations in our conception of sovereignty, they're at least partially rooted in our technological realities too, right? So this was post-Enlightenment. We're going through the industrial age. So we're becoming more productive, more wealthy, more free. And with that, I think people start to kind of fight over the growing pie. And so you see, instead of having one guy call all the shots, as the population grows and becomes more productive, there's this pressure to move towards a more distributed governance system. But the counter force to that would be something like the central bank or fiat currency, which allows those few to start harvesting that economic surplus back off the total economy. And I think that's what's happened in the US is you had this quote from Thomas Jefferson at some point where he said, we're jumping forward a little bit, but he's talking about the US, is that it may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer in the United States. So he's saying there was no income tax, no window tax, there was no plethora of petty taxes. Government was small and local. And that's what, like every other example you've given, it's like when government's small, local, predictable, in terms of taxes and legislation, the economy booms, right? People have sound rules in which to build a strategy and become wealthy. But it's interesting to me that these ebbs and flows are so rooted in kind of the technological realities of the day.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting point. I think you could say that one of the reasons we were able to end slavery, and I'm not just talking about in the United States, I'm talking about across the world. I know it still exists in parts of Africa and so on, but broadly speaking, we have ended slavery. I mean, I know there are sweatshops and all the rest, but people are not traded in the way that they once were. And what has made what you could argue is the single biggest factor in making that possible was not that human beings suddenly became more humane. It was technological process.
Absolutely.
It was the increased product. We had machines to work the fields, so we didn't need slaves to work them anymore.
That's right.
So we could afford to end slavery.
That's right.
What I mean. And so, technological progress and wealth have a huge impact on the moral, what's the word? The moral goodness of
development. Yeah. There's this, the book, The Rational Optimist by
Matt Ridley.
Ridley. Yeah. Ridley. He makes the point that I think the numbers were the average American today, the amount of energy we consume in a year is equivalent to having 660 energy slaves, where we'd have like 660 humans pedaling a bike 24/7, 365 to generate the amount of energy we consume in our day-to-day lives. But of course, we don't have 660 people doing that. We have hydrocarbons, right? We found a way to harness this energy from ancient sunlight effectively and to energize our world. And in doing so, we electrified the grid and we just eliminate all these drudgeries of life. So as people become more free, and in actuality, there's more productivity that percolates up into our morality.
I was watching a film last night, The Man Who Would Be King, which is set in India in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. And there's a scene where you've got the English local VIP. I don't know what his role was. Let's say he was the local minister or something, parliament minister. And there's an Indian guy who's got a string tied round his big toe, and he spends his whole day going back and forth with his foot so that the fan operates to keep the English minister cool.
Oh, God.
They didn't have electric fans.
Yeah.
So they had to get, and this would have been across the hot world. The poor will have been obliged to man the fans for the rich.
Yeah.
Thank goodness for electric fans.
Yeah. And so that...
And you could say, we put those poor electric fan workers out of work. Well, do you know what? Probably it's good that they lost work because the increased wealth as a result of mechanized fans, created more prosperity and opportunity for them to go and do other stuff that was less, less gruesome and demeaning.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'm sure at that time that was probably a socially accepted thing. You walk in to see the local minister and he's got his guy running the fan. You don't even think twice about it. But today, if we saw that, we'd be horrified. It's Yeah, really interesting that
There's the scene in the Jungle Book. If you ever watched the Jungle Book when you were a kid, or you watch it with your kids, and there's the scene with King Louis of the Apes, and he's got all his his lackeys, and they're all holding banana leaves, fanning him with the banana leaves.
right. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I think it's an important way to look at it, and it reframes history in a way too. And you make this point later about the Civil War, where it was more of a practical, pragmatic battle versus this moral crusade that we're taught about in school. I don't want to jump ahead, but just getting to the point that you start to look at history through the lens of necessity more so than I don't know, some type of, it's bottom up, right? It's from wealth up to morality. It's not morality down to wealth.
Energy consumption is an indicator of the sophistication of the civilization.
Yes.
You could do a chart of how sophisticated a civilization is and how much power it uses, and the two would correspond. And you just look at, once upon a time we had to rely on burning fire, and then we discovered, I don't know, whales and various other things we could burn, and gasoline and not gasoline. Oh God, what's the coal and paraffin and so on. And then, we started burning fossil fuels, and now we're slowly starting to discover solar power and other greener forms of energy. I'm actually slightly cynical about how green they are because of the amount of copper and tin they require to function, but that's another matter. So in fact, this criticism of Bitcoin that, it uses too much power. Well, we need money to have a cost of production to it. If money doesn't have a cost of production to it, it's got no value.
Right.
And they forget that the it's that power that makes the network so strong. And God, it frustrates me. I know the woman who wrote, there was an article in the FT last week, and I know the woman who wrote it, Katie Martin. I've sat on Bitcoin panels and, debated Bitcoin with her, and she's just ideologically opposed, and she hates it, and she's always hated it. And, she hates it because people email her and, trying to get her to cover their coin or something. And she just thinks the whole thing is a scam, and she can't recognize how enormously transformative the technology is.
Yeah. Even the term energy consumption, it doesn't ring true, because it's to your point, we need to harness more energy to become more civilized, to eliminate all these drudgeries and become more wealthy. It's about the cleanliness of that energy production process or energy conversion process. And really, in a world where private property rights, Rothbard wrote about this a lot. If we preserve the integrity of private property rights, such that if you're dumping pollution in my river, you're pumping smog into my air, that I can then litigate, then that would actually increase the cost of dirty energy production and drive us towards more clean methods of production. So that's how the market figures it out. Legislation's not going to work.
It's not like the world doesn't realize that we need to get our air cleaner.
Right.
And that, fossil fuels are highly polluting. We've learned that, and we've recognized that, and our cities are getting cleaner as a result. But you don't need to start attacking Bitcoin because it consumes a lot of energy. If you totted up the amount of energy that washing machines use worldwide, then suddenly there'd be a load of people clamoring to ban washing machines.
Exactly.
It's making people feel guilty. I'm not encouraging waste. And, a lot of the time, everyone could run their household more efficiently than they currently do. And if energy prices were higher, then they probably would. Yeah. But the fact that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, I just do not think it's a problem. And the fact that some of it is coal-fired, already that's being addressed.
Yeah.
More and more of it is not coal-fired. I think China did a ban this week on coal-fired Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. To your point, it's a necessity of money. There has to be rooted in economic sacrifice. Otherwise, the system gets corrupt. That's what proof of work is. That's what gold was. That's what Bitcoin is now becoming. So, so we had the Glorious Revolution. sowing the seeds, I guess you would say, for what would become America or the U.S. Constitution.
Mm.
And then the battle cry for the American battle for independence was this taxation without representation is tyranny, right? But in your book, you make a great point that it wasn't that bad. The taxes weren't even that bad. It was more about, I guess, the way it was implemented and the principles behind it.
That's one of the great quote about taxation is from the French finance minister to Louis I'm going to say Louis XV, maybe Louis XVI, was the art of taxation consists of so plucking the goose as to obtain the most feathers with the least possible hissing. And it's a wonderful quote. And, it's why income tax today is such an effective tax, because it's deducted at source.
Mm-hmm.
But people never actually hand the money over. They don't feel the pain of paying the tax. And that's why stealth tax is why inflation is such an effective form of tax, because people don't feel the pain directly. And, while the American settlers might have had these very high opinions of themselves in the late 18th century, that they had the same rights as Englishmen, to the English, America was just another colony.
Yeah.
Treated the same as, I don't know, the Caribbean or India or wherever. And they saw it, as much as anything, as a place to be taxed. And they imposed, it wasn't so much the levels of tax, but it was the imposition of those taxes. There was tax stamp duty. So every time anything was stamped, somebody had to pay a tax. I think there was taxes on playing cards and pamphlets. And then, of course, all the row about tea and the tea taxes. And it was as much as a case of how people were taxed as it was the extent to which they were taxed. And, I think to leave Britain and go sail across the Atlantic and settle in another country denotes a certain amount of get up and go in a person. Particularly in those days, it was not an easy trip, and it involved a considerable amount of bravery. So I think it's fair to say that the American settlers had get up and go. They were brave. They weren't scared to have a fight. They were entrepreneurial and all those things. And so, if they wanted something, they were going to fight for it. And eventually, they probably thought, do you know what? We're better off out.
Yeah.
And so, and many of them, went to war over it. I mean, it was a terribly bloody war.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought the stamp tax was especially interesting in that I believe the British required stamps on all documentation of any kind to legitimize it. So they were almost taxing information flows, right? If you wanted to, it was anything, right? It was a title, a document, an agreement, a contract that had to have this official stamp. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be acknowledged by the legal system.
That's absolutely right. It's about 3 years since I've written the chapter, Robert. So my memory's a little bit sketchy, but I still think, they were really, really objected to, and there were sugar taxes as well. Mm-hmm. But let me grab my book, because there's a wonderful passage. Benjamin Franklin, what a guy Benjamin Franklin was. And he wrote this wonderful, they actually sent Benjamin Franklin as an envoy to come and negotiate with the English to try and talk some sense into them. But the English, of course, ignored him. But he wrote this wonderful satirical column in, I think it was somewhere in Boston. And he called it "The Rules by Which a Great Empire May be Reduced to a Small One."
Oh, yeah.
And he wrote all these satirical rules. These are the things you need to do if you want to mess things up for yourself.
Yeah.
And he wrote this: "To make your taxes more odious and more likely to procure resistance, send from the capital a board of officers to superintend the collection, composed of the most indiscreet, ill-bred and insolent you can find. If any revenue officers are accused of the least tenderness for the people, discard them. If others are justly complained of, promote them." And then he wrote another law: Convert the brave, honest soldiers of your navy into pimping tide waiters and colony officers of the customs. Scour with armed boats every bay, harbour, river, creek, cove and nook throughout the coast of your colonies. Stop and detain every coaster, every wooden boat, every fisherman, tumble their cargoes and even their ballast inside out and upside down. And if a pennyworth of pins is found unentered, let the whole boat be seized and confiscated.
Yeah.
That gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that the English were doing to the Americans at the time. And no wonder they just said, no, enough already.
Yeah. And he's not embellishing, actually. You talked about that, where they would inspect vessels for, I guess, contraband or untaxed or undeclared items. And if they found one infraction on the entire ship, they'd seize the whole vessel.
Yeah. And a lot of the time it wouldn't have been it would have just been an accidental non-compliance. You know,
Right.
it wouldn't have box or something. It wouldn't have necessarily been deliberate.
Right. And it degenerated, this level of authoritarianism degenerated into a lot of paid informants, right? Where people were, I think they were rewarding people to rat out other people on infractions too. They'd give them whatever, a third of the booty, maybe. And that reminded me of what we saw in the kind of late stage USSR, where the state, it was so corrupt and so bad that it completely dissolved trust. People were ratting on each other. If you were even, disclosing to someone your sadness or your unfulfillment with whatever the state was doing, they could arrest you for that in the USSR, because that would imply that the state wasn't doing its utopian job effectively. So it's just, it's a great vignette on how state intervention and authoritarianism dissolves trust, even like it breaks down social cohesion at a really fundamental level.
Nazi Germany did the same. They had kids reporting on their parents for things they'd said, cynical amount. If I had my kids reporting on me for stuff I've said in my house.
So I guess the punchline here was that it was bad tax legislation on the part of the English that ultimately caused the birth of this low tax nation, which was the US. And that the low tax nation and the distributed sovereignty, I guess, in our governance model is what allowed us to become, it laid the groundwork for us to become a world superpower.
100%.
Yeah.
And it was ill-considered taxation on behalf of the British, who at the time faced extraordinary outgoings because they were just going, I don't think we'd quite gone to war with Napoleon yet. That was about probably 10 or 20 years later. But even so, government spending was spiraling, and William Pitt would shortly become the Prime Minister of the UK, and he was notorious for his plethora of petty taxes. I think somebody said about William Pitt, if an object moves, he will tax it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I read the list in your book, and they were literally trying to tax every item, right? Yeah. Everything that you use in life, right? Like your chapstick, your computer monitor, your books, your windows, your locks, your keys. The equivalent today would be that I'm saying everything that you see and touch was being taxed.
Yeah, well, it is today, except we don't notice it because we don't actually pay out the tax.
Yeah.
He even taxed. William Pitt's taxes even affected fashion, because he started to tax wig powder, and everyone in those days wore wigs. And then when we went to war with Napoleon, there was quite a few people who disagreed. They were conscientious objectors. They didn't think we should be going to war with Napoleon. And so in order to denote their disagreement with the war, they stopped wearing wigs. And then they started to become quite fashionable. And then, of course, the increasing cost of wig powder, because Pitt was taxing it, meant that more and more people stopped wearing their wigs. And then wig wearing just died a death altogether.
Wow.
Pitt taxed the business into oblivion.
Reminds me of the beards that you said, was it the Russian guy that taxed the beards?
Peter the Great,
yeah. Well, so that's a good pivot then into France, because there was a lot of this weird taxation going on in France as well during roughly the same period. So the first thing I thought was really interesting, you said smuggling was really hard to prevent because France had so much coastline, so they couldn't stop these smuggled goods from getting into the mainland. But what they ended up doing instead was building a second wall inside of the wall guarding Paris, specifically for tax collecting. So these were the literal gatekeepers, right?
Yeah, they were. And in fact, a lot of the Great Walls we think were built to keep intruders out. But a lot of the time, Hadrian's Wall that marked the border between England and Scotland, and the Great Wall of China, a lot of the time they were built simply to make tax collection easier, because they forced everyone through the gate.
Right.
And then when they come through the gate, you can get your taxes off them. And so, but yeah, they built these little walls. France just had, I think at one point France, you think French and the wine, but at one point France had 5 different taxes on wine, from the harvesting of the grape through to the processing of the wine, so that by the time they drank the wine, they paid 5 different taxes on the way. And to the extent that the peasants couldn't afford to drink wine, so they drank cider instead.
Wow.
Yeah, but the French Revolution was perhaps the most classic case of the most explicit revolution. No, American Revolution was the most explicit against taxes, with no taxation without representation. But it was taxes that caused the French Revolution as well. And all those revolutions, the English Civil War, then the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, they all formed, what followed was the nation states that we know today.
Yeah, there was the tax farming that got really big in France, right? Yeah. Where I guess to collect the taxes, the king or the sovereign was employing these tax farmers who, what are they? Debt collectors essentially, but brutal and clearly kind of cunning in their ways. But the problem with it, of course, became that they started taking such a heavy skim. They were skimming so much of this wealth that they were collecting that only a trickle of it got back to the treasury.
Yeah, there was one point where the king was sat at the table and he was trying to have it explained to him why revenue was so low. And somebody took out a block of ice and put it on the table and got everyone round the table to pass the block of ice, one person to the next person to the next person. And then by the time it got to the king, it had melted. And and then he had to explain to him, that's why he hasn't got any taxes.
Yeah. That's great.
Everyone had their hand in. It was more lucrative to be a tax farmer than it was to go and do something productive.
Yeah. You said what?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So you just get you and a couple of muscly people to go and collect salt taxes or whatever it was, and the ordinary citizen, it was collected by force, and the tax farmers collected it, and they kept some of it for themselves, and they passed the rest up the hierarchy, and there was several different levels of the hierarchy before it got to the king, and everyone was in on it, and it was basically crony capitalism gone mad.
Yeah. You said one of the tax farmers became so rich that he purchased the Louisiana, all of French Louisiana, right? He became like one of the wealthiest guys in the world at the time.
That's absolutely right. I've forgotten that. I had forgotten that. Yeah. What was his name, that guy? He owned all of French Louisiana.
Yeah. He was Antoine Crozat.
Oh, yeah.
He grew so rich, he would count French Louisiana, all of it, among his assets.
And French Louisiana was basically everything from, it wasn't just Louisiana, it would be Louisiana, it would be pretty much all of the Mississippi Delta.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, I think so. So this is Voltaire, great philosopher, writing, and he's describing how the tax collectors came to one of his estates one day. The gendarme of the tax farmers, the gendarme would be the military, the policeman, basically. marched about in groups of about 50, stopped all, excuse me, stopped all vehicles, searched all the pockets, forced their way into all the houses, and made every kind of damage there in the name of the king, and made the peasants buy them off with money.
Wow.
So that was what was going on.
Taxation is extortion.
I'll say, certainly was then.
Yeah. Wow. And this, I love that you brought up Voltaire too, because this is another really interesting part I found in the book, is that this was right around, the printing press had been around for, I guess, a couple hundred years by this point. The distribution of information was much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And we had things like this. There was the 27-volume Encyclopédie, I guess is how you maybe say it in French. And it was issued with this express purpose to change the way people think. And the philosophers of the time, including Voltaire, they started becoming very instrumental in changing people's perceptions of the world, right? So this again, and they had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which were liberty, equality, inviolability of property, and the right to resist oppression.
That's absolutely right. And they spread them. They were written in the vernacular. And, the parallels between the encyclopedia and the internet today, and the spreading of free thought and the spreading of subversive anti-authoritarian thought, that was a huge factor in the intellectual, revolutions. You got to have an intellectual, you got to win the intellectual war as well as the physical war.
That's right.
And I guess often the intellectual war is won by one side and the physical war is won by another. But in the case of the French Revolution, the revolutionaries won in order to get France to the point of revolution, they had to convince the French, particularly the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, of a bit like the arguments that are going on about free speech today.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the free speech advocates are winning those war. But there's some great quotes. This was in the encyclopedia. In the matter of taxation, every privilege is an injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's Voltaire, and that I presume he means by every tax break, every subsidy, every time when one person pays. That was one of the things about the French tax system. People weren't taxed equally. Different people paid different rates, and that pissed people off.
Interesting.
And then Rousseau said, he who only has the bare necessities of life should pay nothing. And then this was Raynal said, of the poor man, France's tax system makes them a beggar. Of the workman, an idler. Of an unfortunate, a rogue.
Yeah.
And you can we were talking about, all the government incentives to do with COVID and all the fraud and so on.
Yeah.
But that's going on. It's made the poor man a beggar. It's made the workman an idler. And it's made the unfortunate a rogue. I mean, again, there's just so many parallels.
Yeah. No, I see it. This is so salient to me because I see it as the liquidity of ideas dissolving traditional power structures in a way. It's like people were starting to think differently again because of a change in technological realities, right? We had the printing press and pamphlets and all these the encyclopedia. I don't know how you say that word. It's encyclopedia.
I think it's encyclopedia, but I'm not sure. Maybe
encyclopedia.
I don't know.
And this, I love that specifically the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the inviolability of property, right? That became something seated here in the American consciousness, like that. The right to life, liberty, and property is something that we take historically, proclaim and take very seriously.
I think there's a genuine feeling in the authoritarian left that they have a right to your property.
Of course.
And we've seemed to have lost sight of how essential to a good functioning society property rights are. And it's like right at the basis, one of the essential building blocks. And, we seem to have lost sight of that.
Yes. Yeah.
That man earns too much. We have to confiscate some of his wealth. No.
It's crazy. Honestly, it's crazy to try and justify compulsion or theft. And if you consider that property, it's really the whole game. We say life, liberty, and property, but you are your own property too. Your time, your body, your attention. So that it's really just property. It's like whatever yourself and whatever you spend your time and energy adding value to, you should have exclusive rights to, basically.
I use taxation. I think I've said this already, but I'll say it again. I use taxation to describe that because in an anarchy where there's no taxes, this is theoretical, of course, because one of my other arguments is you can't have a civilization without taxation of some form, but you can have voluntary. But anyway, in an anarchy where there is no tax, the worker owns all of his own body and all of his own labor. And at the other extreme, you have at one extreme, you have a totalitarian state, North Korea or Soviet Russia or something, where the worker owns pretty much none of his own labor. Right. He still kind of owns his own body. And then one stage on from that, you have slavery, where he owns neither his own body nor his own labor. That's like 100% the opposite of an anarchy.
Right.
And we're 40, 50, 60% of labor is owned in the social democracies of the West at the moment. So we're sort of somewhere in between those two extremes.
Yeah. And there's some tipping point where it breaks down and people have just had enough, right? Like you're taking too much of my property or time, and it incites revolution. There's this one quote by Ayn Rand I'll read in regard to property.
I love it.
So it says, the right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man who has no right to the product of his effort has no means to sustain his life. The man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. Powerful.
It is. She's like, I find her books quite hard to read, but I could spend my whole day reading her quotes.
I am ashamed to say I haven't read anything of hers yet, but people are really pushing me to, so I'm gonna start.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of the great philosophers.
Yeah,
and she took no prisoners. Like I have a go at myself sometimes because I'm a bit too compromising, and I don't like to get into fights with people, so I'll try and compromise. But she didn't compromise. Michael Saylor doesn't compromise. Dominic Frisby shouldn't compromise, and he does too often.
But that one that I keep zeroing in on, the inviolability of property.
Yeah.
I like this so much because it was just an idea, but it actually, I would argue that idea was not possible to implement prior to Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is the greatest implementation of the idea that property cannot be violated ever, because it's the only property right that can live in your mind, right? You can actually hold your private keys in your brain to the point where the only way to take it is for you to voluntarily surrender it. Now, you could argue that someone could torture you until you give up your private key or whatever. Sure, I guess that's a valid argument. It ignores the different ways you can custody Bitcoin that could prevent that. But the point is that at the end of the day, to surrender that property, it has to be voluntarily surrendered by you, versus if you have a chest of gold coins in your house, someone can come in and involuntarily take that away from you, right? They don't need your consent. But to surrender your Bitcoin private key requires consent due to its informational nature. So I think this is very powerful. Maybe that Bitcoin is this realization of this ancient, older idea.
Yeah, I mean, certainly digitally it is. I mean, it can be forced out of you by, I put you through an incredible amount of pain, and I force you to give me your keys.
Yes, but at that point of surrender, even it's consensual, right? Someone is, even if you've tortured them, they have to be like, they've had to reach a point that they said, okay, I'm now going to surrender this key. You can't come and take your hand and pull it out of my head, is what I'm trying to say.
I accept that. Yeah. And I would add to it, we talked about this in the last program. It's the first time we've had a money that governments can't print. You could say that gold was a money that governments can't print, and they couldn't. But governments and kings and so on would occupy the gold resources.
Mm-hmm.
When they conquered somewhere new, they would loot the gold resources and they'd remint the money with their own image on it. And part of conquering a country would be conquering the gold supplies, the mines and so on. So rulers could take control of it. It's very different with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So I think it changes the nature of rule.
Yes.
We talked already about how I did anyway, about how technology is our new ruler.
Yes.
Certainly in the digital world. But so, Bitcoin is extraordinarily transformative for that reason. Extraordinarily.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to realize, I think, here too, that fiat currency inflation is a violation of private property rights.
Oh my God, isn't it so?
Like, that's all it is. It's nothing else, actually.
My left-wing mates, and I have way too many, I should know better. They don't see anything wrong with it. They think money printing is fine. They've all got their houses and the house prices go up, so it suits them on a personal level. And I think they think that it's the only way to deal with the situation we're in. And they don't trust individuals to be left alone and negotiate their own. I happen to think, for example, a voluntarist approach might have resulted in better outcomes in COVID than a
yeah, I agree.
One-size-fits-all approach.
I agree completely.
But we'll never know. But that's just beyond their ken. You have to have some kind of government directive, government ruling.
But I think your book has proven that technological realities are percolating up through individuals, right? To change morality, to change our conception of freedom. Whatever. Now, it takes a long time. I'm not saying you just switch out of tech and then change people instantly. It's intergenerational. But to not trust the sovereignty of the individual, I think, is just a deep ideological fallacy of some kind. Like, the individual is the acting agent in the world. To try and say anything else, to try to say, no, the individual needs to be subordinate to any group, whether it's government, anything, any other group. It just doesn't make logical or moral sense.
If you look at the revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, and then you look at the world today, there are so many parallels, so many. Excess taxation, inequitable taxation, the rise of a new form of media, the debasement of currency, the excess government activity meddling in ideas they shouldn't, the crony capitalism, the leeching classes. There are just so many parallels. And, you can just feel discontent. Maybe it's just my Twitter bubble, but you can feel discontent. Something's coming. But the question I ask myself is whatever's coming, the difference in how armed an ordinary citizen was compared to the military in the 17th and 18th century was not that different. The military would have had better weapons, but they weren't that much better. Whereas today, in Europe, we don't have guns and the army does. And in America, the army has better guns. So I don't know if it ends with violence, but there's definitely some kind of revolution happening. Maybe it's just we lead these. It's going to be a bit like Avatar or something, where we're sort of stuck in the physical world in reality, and we lead these sort of second digital lives of total freedom.
Yeah, the 3D printing is an interesting wild card too. And talking about the asymmetry of weaponry, that could, depending which way that goes, that could largely balance the playing field. I don't know if you've seen some of these 3D printed weapons, but you can print anything you want.
What, like a bazooka or something? Anything.
Like, I don't know about bazooka per se. I was just thinking automatic weaponry. Like, you can print a 50 caliber type machine gun that you'd see on the back of a Humvee. You can print those now. Okay. I'm not 100% clear on how, you can source the ammunition, if you can print the ammunition. I'm no expert, but if you just look at a few of these videos online, the guns that are being printed, they're indistinguishable from, guns we thought we didn't know you could print, let's say.
Yeah. I hope it doesn't end with violence.
Yeah, I hope not too, but man, if you just glance at history.
I hope we get an English revolution and a bloodless revolution, as opposed to an American or a French one.
Another
glorious
bloodless
revolution took 50 years of civil war to achieve. Wasn't that bloodless?
So then there was getting back to the French arc here, that eventually they had the revolution, right? So the people got sick of it. They brought out the guillotines, the heads rolled. But then there were bills to pay after the fact. And that was the assignat episode, right? Where they actually started.
Yeah.
How do you say it? Sorry?
They started assignat.
Assignat.
Yeah, the GN, assignat, in French, the GN is nya.
Assignat.
And so, they stole a load of money. They stole a lot of land off the Catholic Church. That was another thing. The church was very corrupt, and that was sort of the end of the Catholic Church in France as a huge power thing. They confiscated a lot of land off the Catholic Church and then issued paper money based on representing some of that land. Then, of course, the paper money did very well, and so they started issuing more of the paper money without backing it with land.
Yeah.
And it very quickly erupted in hyperinflation.
Yeah, I just actually finished a book on this called Fiat Currency Inflation in France.
I know that.
That walks through the whole episode. It's a short book, but such an elegant description of the corrosive influence of inflation, right? It talks about people, social morality going down the tubes, people becoming more intent on gambling. They ultimately burned the printing press, I think, on public display to finally put an end to the inflation. But it was a long, drawn out, miserable affair. And from the ashes of that hyperinflation came Napoleon.
Yeah. And when he walked through Paris, the streets of Paris, the people shouted out, "Plus d'impôts, à bas des riches, à bas la République, vive l'empereur," which means no more taxes, down with the rich, down with the republic, long live the emperor.
Wow.
But no more taxes, the first thing they said.
Yeah.
And by this point, France was so bankrupt that it did what must be the worst real estate deal in all history. It is extraordinary. And the beneficiary of this was the United States, but it was in 1803. It sold all its land in the United States, 800,000 square miles, for $15 million, okay, which works out at 3 cents an acre.
And this was
it was basically the entire Mississippi Delta.
Right. I think we call this Louisiana Purchase in the U.S.
Yes, Louisiana Purchase. Yeah. And what a deal that was by your American former leaders.
And this was the same dynamic that would cause the rise of Hitler over a century later, right? It's hyperinflation. People get so sick of the ruling classes, the taxes, the inflation, that they just want to vest powers into the most seemingly capable guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, clearly the absolute power imparted corrupts absolutely, and you get these disastrous outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely right.
But for a while there, under Napoleon, and you said in your book, taxes were lower, fairer, and more efficient, and France thrived. So he actually does, and Hitler did the same. They come into this economic mess with an iron fist. They lay down some solid rules, and the economy flourishes for a short time. Yeah,
I mean, Hitler, the Nazis, they were quite naughty with their taxes. What Napoleon did is he just imposed extraordinarily punitive taxes on northern Italy. Okay. So that's fine for the French, but the northern Italians were paying the tax, and Hitler did the same with the Jews. He just, before he murdered them, he taxed them to death pretty much. So I can't remember the exact figure, but it's in the book. But I think something like 1/3 of entire Nazi spending came from looting Jews in the entire world. From 1932 through to 45 or whatever it was, looted Jewish wealth. So they didn't tax they taxed their enemies, they taxed their conquered lands.
Yeah.
But they didn't tax their own citizens.
Right. And yeah, you made the same point with Napoleon, that was actually his vulnerability, is that he needed to conquer new lands to sustain revenue. Otherwise, he couldn't keep going to war.
Same problem that Rome had.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. The United States has done 2 amazing real estate deals. There's the Louisiana Purchase in Alaska as well.
Yeah.
It's a good real estate deal.
Lots
Maybe
of
your
oil.
leaders should stick to real estate. Start dealing with whoever owns Greenland and maybe chunks of Canada and lay off the war and everything else you get up to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point.